A murmur of laughter went through some of the warriors summoned to the meeting. A dozen of them, like us, had been fighting on the mainland, but the remainder were intimates of Prince Lancelot, and had been newly promoted into captains for this siege. Bors, Lancelot's cousin, was Benwick's champion and commander of the palace guard. He at least had seen some fighting, and had earned a reputation as a warrior, though now, sprawling long-legged in a Roman uniform, and with his black hair, like his cousin Lancelot's, oiled flat against his skull, he looked jaded. "How many spears do we have?" I asked. Lancelot had ignored me till then. I knew he had not forgotten our meeting of 2 years before, but he nevertheless smiled at my question. "We have 420 men under arms, and each of them has a spear. Can you work out the answer?" I returned the silky smile. "Spears break, Lord Prince, and men defending walls throw their spears like javelins. When 420 spears are thrown, what do we throw next?" "Poets," Keelook growled, luckily too softly for Ban to hear. "There are spares," Lancelot said airily. "And besides, we shall use the spears the Franks throw at us." "Poets, for sure," Keelook said. "You spoke, Lord Keelook?" Lancelot asked. "I belched, Lord Prince, but while I have your gracious attention, do we have archers?" "Some. Many. 10. "The gods help us," Keelook said, and slid down in his chair. He hated chairs. Elaine spoke next, reminding us that the island was sheltering women, children, and the world's greatest poets. "The safety of the Fili is in your hands," she told us, "and you know what will happen to them if you fail." I kicked Keelook to stop him from making a comment. Ban stood and gestured towards his library. 7,843 scrolls are in there," he said solemnly. "The accumulated treasures of human knowledge, and if the city falls, so will civilization." He then told us an ancient tale of a hero going into a labyrinth to kill a monster, and trailing behind him a woolen thread, with which he could find his way out of the darkness. "My library," he finally explained the point of the long tale, "is that thread. Lose it, gentlemen, and we stay in eternal darkness. So I beg you, fight." He paused, smiling. "And I have summoned help. Letters are gone to Broceliande and to Arthur. I think the day is not far off when our horizon will be thick with friendly sails. And Arthur, remember, is oath-bound to help us." "Arthur," Keelook intervened, "has his hands full of Saxons." "An oath is an oath," Ban said reprovingly. Galahad inquired whether we planned to make our own raids on the Frankish encampments ashore. We could easily go by boat, he said, landing east or west of their positions. But Lancelot turned down the idea. "If we leave the walls," he said, "we die. It is that simple." "No sallies?" Keelook asked in disgust. "If we leave the walls," Lancelot repeated, "we die. Your orders are simple. You stay behind the walls." He announced that Benwick's best warriors, 100 veterans of the war on the mainland, would guard the main gate. We 50 surviving Dumnonians were given the western walls, while the city's levies, bolstered by fugitives from the mainland, guarded the rest of the island. Lancelot himself, with a company of the white-cloaked palace guard, would form the reserve that would watch the fighting from the palace and come down to intervene wherever their help was needed. "Might as well call on the fairies," Keelook growled to me. "Another belch?" Lancelot inquired. "It's all the fish I eat, Lord Prince," Keelook said. King Ban invited us to inspect his library before we left, perhaps wanting to impress us with the value of what we defended. Most of the men who had been at the council of war shuffled in, gaped at the pigeonholed scrolls, then went to stare at the bare-breasted harpist who played in the library's antechamber. Galahad and I lingered longer among the books, where the hump-backed Father Selwyn was still bent over his old table, where he was trying to keep his grey cat from playing with his quill. "Still working out the wingspan of angels, Father?" I asked him. "Someone must," he said, then turned to scowl at me with his one eye. "Who are you?" "Derval, Father, of Dumnonia. We met 2 years ago. I'm surprised you're still here." "Your surprise is of no interest to me, Derval of Dumnonia. Besides, I did leave for a while. I went to Rome. Filthy place. I thought the Vandals might have cleaned it up, but the place is still full of priests and their plump little boys. So I came back here. Ban's harpists are much prettier than Rome's catamites." He gave me an unfriendly look. "Do you care about my safety, Derval of Dumnonia?" I could hardly answer no, though I was tempted to. "My job is to protect lives," I said rather pretentiously. "Including yours, Father." "Then I put my life in your hands, Derval of Dumnonia," he said, as he turned his ugly face back to the table and pushed the cat away from his quill. "I lay my life on your conscience, Derval of Dumnonia. And now you can go and fight and leave me to do something useful." I tried to ask the priest about Rome, but he waved my questions away, and so I went down to the storehouse on the western wall that would be our home for the rest of the siege. Galahad, who considered himself an honorary Dumnonian now, was with us, and he and I tried to count the Franks who were retreating from the incoming tide after another attempt to discover the track across the sands. The bards, singing of Innistrib's siege, say the enemy outnumbered the grains of sand in the bay. They were not quite that many, but still they were formidable. Every Frankish warband in western Gaul had combined to help capture Innistrib's, the jewel of Armorica, which, it was rumoured, was crammed with the treasures of Rome's fallen empire. Galahad estimated we were faced by 3,000 Franks. My guess was 2,000, while Lancelot assured us there were 10,000. But by anyone's count, there was a terrible lot of them. The first attacks brought the Franks nothing but disaster. They found a way across the sand and assaulted the main gate and were repelled bloodily. Then, the next day, they attacked our part of the wall, and were given the same treatment, only this time they stayed too long, and a large part of their force was cut off by the incoming tide. Some tried to wade to the mainland and were drowned. Others retreated to the shrinking stretch of sand before our walls, where they were slaughtered by a sally of spearmen, led from the gate by Blethig, the chief who had fetched me to Benwick, and who was now the leader of Benwick's veterans. Blethig's sortie across the sand was in direct disobedience to Lancelot's rule that we must stay inside the city's wall. But the dead were so many that Lancelot pretended to have ordered the attack, and later, after Blethig's death, he even claimed to have led the sally. The filly made a song, telling how Lancelot had damned the bay with Frankish dead. But in truth, the prince stayed in the palace while Blethig attacked. For days afterwards, the bodies of Frankish warriors swilled around the island's base, carried by the tide and providing rich carrion for the gulls. The Franks then began to build a proper causeway. They cut hundreds of trees and laid them on the sand, then weighted the trunks with rocks carried to the shore by slaves. The tides in Innistrib's wide bay were fierce, sometimes rising 40 feet, and the new causeway was ripped by the currents, so that at low tide the flats were littered with floating logs. But always the Franks brought more trees and stone, and so plugged the gaps. They had captured thousands of slaves, and did not care how many died in building the new road. The causeway became longer as our food supplies grew shorter. Our few remaining boats still went fishing, and others carried grain from Broceliande. But the Franks launched their own boats from the shore, and after 2 of our fishing boats were captured and their crews disemboweled, our shipmasters stayed at home. The poets on the hilltop, posturing with their spears, lived off the palace's rich stores, but we warriors scraped barnacles off the rocks, ate mussels and razor clams, or stewed the rats we trapped in our storehouse that was still filled with pelts, salt, and barrels of nails. We did not starve. We had willow fish traps at the base of the rocks, and most days they yielded a few small fish, though at low tide the Franks would send raiding parties to destroy the traps. At high tide, the Frankish boats rowed round the island to pull up the fish traps set further from the city's shore. The bay was shallow enough for the enemy to see the traps, and then to break them with spears. One such boat grounded on its return to the mainland, and was left stranded a quarter-mile from the city as the tide fell. Killock ordered a sortie, and 30 of us climbed down fishing nets suspended from the wall's top. The 12 men of the boat's crew fled as we approached, and inside the abandoned craft we found a barrel of salted fish and 2 dry loaves of bread that we carried back in triumph. When the tide rose, we brought the boat back to the city and tied it safe beneath our wall. Lancelot watched our disobedience, but sent no reprimand, though a message did come from Queen Elaine demanding to know what supplies we had fetched back from the ship. We sent some dried fish up the road, and no doubt the gift was construed as an insult. Lancelot then accused us of capturing the boat, so that we could desert Innistribes, and ordered us to deliver the ship to the island's small harbour. For answer, I climbed the hill to the palace, and demanded that he back up his accusation of cowardice with his sword. I shouted the challenge around the courtyard, but the prince and his poets stayed inside their locked doors. I spat on their threshold and left. Galahad was happier the more desperate things became. Part of his happiness sprang from the presence of Leonore, the harpist who had welcomed me 2 years before, the girl for whom Galahad had confessed his lust to me, the same girl Lancelot had raped. She and Galahad lived in a corner of the storeroom. We all had women. There was something about the hopelessness of our plight that eroded normal behavior, and so we crammed as much living as we could into those hours before our expected deaths. The women stood guard with us, and hurled rocks whenever the Franks tried to dismantle our fragile fish traps. We had long run out of spears, except for those we had brought to Benwick ourselves, and which we were saving for the main assault. Our handful of archers had no missiles, except the one shot into the city by the Franks, and that supply increased when the enemy's causeway was a short bow shot from the city gate. The Franks erected a timber fence at the end of the causeway, and their archers stood behind the fence and poured arrows on the gate's defenders. The Franks made no attempt to extend the causeway all the way to the city, for the new roadway was only ever intended to give them a dry passage to the place where their assault could begin. We knew that attack must come soon. It was early summer when the causeway was finished. The moon was full and brought huge tides. For much of the time the causeway was under water, but at low tide the sand stretched wide about Innistribes, and the Franks, who were learning the secrets of the sandflats day by day, ranged all about us. Their drums were our constant music, and their threats were ever in our ears. One day brought a feast special to their tribes, and instead of attacking us, they lit great fires on the beach, then marched a column of slaves to the causeway's end, where, one by one, the captives were beheaded. The slaves were Britons, some of them with relatives watching from the city's wall, and the barbarism of the slaughter goaded some of Innistribes' defenders to rush out of the gate in a vain attempt to rescue the doomed women and children. The Franks were waiting for the attack, and formed a shield wall on the sand. But the men of Innistribes, crazed by anger and hunger, charged home,